The harsh rattle of a distant car engine breaks the stillness of the empty street. But it is not the sound that causes every nerve in the veteran's body to tighten. No, it is the piercing bark of his K9 partner, Rex. He knows something is wrong. The dog, once his loyal protector, now stands still, ears perked, staring at the newcomer who approaches their secluded home. The stranger's face is obscured by the dim light of dusk, but it is clear that this is no ordinary visitor. Rex's bark intensifies, not out of aggression, but with a deep primal warning. The veteran, once a man hardened by war, feels his chest tighten. There is something more to this situation, something that doesn't sit right. His instincts, honed over years of service, tell him to wait, to observe. But as the stranger's silhouette grows closer, the dog does not relent. The veteran speaks softly to Rex, but the dog's gaze never falters. In that instant, the stranger stops in their tracks. The silence between them is thick, heavy, and full of unspoken truths. Why did Rex bark? What is the dog trying to tell him? The veteran's past, one filled with secrets, loss, and betrayal, might finally catch up with him. The veteran, Sergeant John Turner, had never imagined returning to his quiet suburban life would feel so unfamiliar. The neighborhood was everything he had left behind when he enlisted. Familiar streets, the old grocery store on the corner, the same barbershop that had always been there. Yet, as he made his way to his modest home, the weight of it all felt strange. And more unsettling than anything was the silence that greeted him upon his arrival. Rex, his war dog, had been his constant companion in the harshest environments. Together they had fought battles in distant lands, shared the isolation of military life, and felt the bond that only war dogs and their handlers could understand. But that bond, once unbreakable, had seemed to fray when John had left the military. After a year of being apart, returning to a life of peace and routine had felt like an alien world. And so his first task upon returning had been to reconnect with the only thing that had ever made him feel truly alive: Rex. But that first reunion was nothing like he had hoped. John walked slowly up the familiar gravel path that led to the front door, his hands tense in his pockets. The door creaked as it opened, and he stepped inside, glancing around. The house, although small and humble, was filled with remnants of his past. Military awards on the wall, old photographs, and the faint scent of leather from Rex's collar. It was as if nothing had changed, but everything had. "Rex?" John called out, his voice hoarse from the weight of the moment. There was a slight rustling from the corner of the living room. John's heart lifted. He had missed his dog's presence more than anything. But as Rex emerged from the shadows, there was something off. Rex's tail didn't wag with the joy he had anticipated. The dog's movements were slow, deliberate, almost hesitant, as if unsure of the man who had once been his constant companion. "Come on, boy, it's me," John said softly, kneeling down to extend his hand. But Rex took a step back, his eyes darting, studying John with a wariness that cut deep. John froze. His heart skipped a beat, a sense of dread creeping over him. This was not how it was supposed to be. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times in his mind. Rex jumping into his arms, tail wagging wildly as if nothing had changed. But instead, there was only a gulf of uncertainty between them. "Rex," John tried again, his voice softer now. He could feel his throat tighten, a knot of confusion and pain forming inside him. Why wasn't Rex recognizing him? They had been through so much together. How could the dog forget everything they had shared? How could this bond, once so strong, now feel like it was slipping through his fingers like sand? The dog's response was a low growl, a sound so unlike the Rex John had known. The growl was not fierce, but cautious. It was as if Rex was not just guarding the house, but guarding himself from something or someone. John slowly stood, his mind racing, trying to make sense of the situation. The dog he had known in the war was gone. This was not the same animal that had saved his life more than once. There was no recognition, no warmth in the dog's eyes. Rex seemed like a stranger. The air between them was thick with tension. John knew Rex was not at fault, but the disconnection still stung. This was more than just a dog acting skittish after being apart for too long. Something was wrong, and John couldn't figure out what it was. His mind wandered to the battlefield, the long months of trauma, exhaustion, and loss. Had the dog changed because of the war? Was Rex now haunted by the things they had seen together? Was it the strain of separation, the isolation of his military life that had caused this emotional fracture? For the next few days, John tried everything he could think of to bring Rex back. He took the dog on long walks, reintroduced familiar scents, and even tried to engage in the old games they had once played. But each time, Rex remained distant, his behavior erratic, cautious, and detached. John watched from the sidelines, heartbroken and confused. He had thought returning home would bring peace, but it had only added to his turmoil. The silence in the house felt heavier than ever. He had a new life now, but it was incomplete. Without Rex, the world felt empty. Without the dog who had saved his life countless times, who had kept him grounded and focused, there was a part of him that felt like he had lost his identity. John was not just struggling with the disconnection between himself and Rex. He was grappling with a larger question: who was he now? The veteran, the soldier, the man who had fought on foreign soil. He was no longer that person. He had come home, but he was not sure where home was anymore. His family had moved on, and the life he had once known was no longer there to return to. In an attempt to understand Rex's behavior, John sought help from a local animal behaviorist. The woman, Dr. Evelyn Moore, had seen many cases of military dogs adjusting to civilian life. When she arrived at John's home, Rex was immediately on edge. He kept his distance from her, pacing the room in tight, cautious circles. Dr. Moore watched the dog closely, then turned to John. "The bond is still there, Sergeant, but it's not what it used to be. Rex has been through something that's made him doubt the world around him, especially when it comes to people he once trusted. This might take time." But time was something John felt he did not have. The walls seemed to close in, and each day Rex grew more distant. The emotional wound that John had expected to heal had only deepened. His worst fear was coming true. He and Rex were no longer the inseparable team they once were. Then one evening, something happened. John sat in the living room, staring out at the darkening sky, when he heard it. A faint scratch at the door. He opened it slowly, heart pounding. Weiber, Lars Reunite, standing just outside the threshold, was Rex. The dog's eyes were different now, distant, yet there was something in them that made John's breath catch. As the dog stepped inside, he didn't hesitate. Rex moved closer to John, sniffing him cautiously but with a renewed sense of curiosity. The space between them, though still charged with unspoken words, felt different. For the first time in days, John saw a flicker of recognition in Rex's eyes. But as they locked eyes, something else shifted. The air became thick with tension again. But now it was not just the dog's uncertainty. It was the mystery of what had happened to them both. What had truly caused this rift? Was it the war? Was it the separation? Or was it something darker, something neither of them fully understood? John had no answers. But in that moment, he knew one thing for certain: his mission was far from over. This was not just about getting Rex to recognize him again. It was about understanding why the dog had changed, why their bond had faltered, and what was truly at stake if they could not find a way back to each other. The days that followed were a constant battle for John. His connection with Rex, once so strong, now felt like a fragile thread barely holding together. But despite the overwhelming uncertainty and the painful gap that seemed to grow with each passing day, he refused to give up. There was still something in Rex's eyes, a flicker, a hint, that told him his dog was still there, somewhere beneath the layers of confusion and distrust. But no matter how hard he tried to bridge the chasm between them, the dog remained distant. The bond they had once shared seemed lost, and John was unsure how to retrieve it. It started with the smallest of things, the tiniest moments that made John's heart beat a little faster. One afternoon, he walked into the backyard, calling out Rex's name in the soft, familiar tone he had used countless times before. At first, Rex didn't react, but as John called again, a slight twitch in the dog's ear caught his attention. Rex's head turned just slightly, his eyes focused on John for a brief second before they darted away. "Rex?" John called again, the question in his voice filled with uncertainty. This time there was no growl, no hesitation. The dog's eyes lingered a moment longer, and for the first time in what felt like weeks, there was a flicker of recognition. A glimmer that John held onto with everything he had. That evening, as John sat on the porch, he whistled, the sharp, distinct sound that had always signaled Rex to come running. At first there was nothing, no movement, no reaction. But then, just as John let out a sigh of frustration, he heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible shuffle of paws against gravel. John's heart raced, his breath catching in his throat. Rex, slow and cautious, emerged from the shadows. For the briefest of moments, it felt like the old Rex was back. His steps were still hesitant, but the dog's gaze was softer, less wary. John stood slowly, unsure whether to approach or wait. It was a moment of tentative hope, but it was fleeting. Rex's gaze shifted away again, and the wall that had been so carefully built between them seemed to grow a little taller. Despite these small victories, there were moments when the gap felt too wide to close. The emotional toll on John was mounting. Every day he did his best to reintegrate into civilian life, trying to rebuild relationships, settle into a routine. But everything felt hollow. Nothing seemed to fill the void left by the broken bond with Rex. The days that had once been filled with purpose now dragged on with agonizing slowness. One evening, after a failed attempt at playing fetch with Rex, John sat on the couch, watching his dog cautiously move around the room. He reached out, hand outstretched, in what had once been a comforting gesture, but Rex flinched, backing away. The sight of it was like a punch to the gut. "Why don't you trust me anymore?" John muttered to himself, his voice thick with emotion. It was a question he had asked countless times since his return, but never received an answer. Rex's refusal to connect, to even acknowledge John's attempts, made him wonder if he was losing the one thing that had mattered most to him, his purpose. Later that night, John sat in the kitchen, a drink in hand, staring out into the darkness. The house felt too quiet, too empty. He had been away from the front lines for months, but it seemed like he was still fighting battles. This time, inside his own home. Was this the price of war? Was this what it took to survive? Was Rex simply a casualty of it all? To keep himself grounded, John began to remember the times when things had been different. He closed his eyes and memories flooded his mind, each one sharper than the last. The first time he had met Rex was at a military base, just days before their first deployment. John had been skeptical of the dog at first. After all, he was a soldier, and the idea of bonding with a dog seemed foreign. But from the very first moment, Rex had understood him in a way no human ever had. They were a perfect match. Rex had been there for him in the most unimaginable of circumstances, pulling him out of harm's way, offering comfort during the darkest nights, and standing guard when everyone else was asleep. One memory, in particular, stood out in John's mind. They were deep in enemy territory, trapped in an abandoned building as gunfire rang out in every direction. Rex, ever vigilant, had been the first to notice the enemy approaching. Without hesitation, the dog had leapt to action, barking and growling, alerting John and his comrades just in time to avoid an ambush. It had been a life-saving moment, one that John would never forget. The bond had been forged in the fires of war, and it had been solidified with every life they had saved together. John opened his eyes, his fingers clenched tightly around the glass in his hand. That bond had been built on trust, loyalty, and shared hardship. He had to find a way to rebuild that connection with Rex, no matter how hard it was. As the days passed, there were moments of fleeting connection, each one a small victory. One morning, after John had gone for a run, Rex followed him into the kitchen. The dog stopped just inside the doorway, watching John closely. Without thinking, John whistled, a short, quick sound that had once been enough to make Rex jump into action. To John's surprise, Rex responded, his ears perking up, tail swaying slightly. It was the smallest of steps, but it was progress. But with every step forward, there seemed to be 2 steps back. John noticed that Rex was showing affection to others, particularly to the neighbors' children who had taken a liking to the dog. They would visit daily, offering Rex treats and pets, and each time the dog responded with excitement and warmth. Watching this, John couldn't help but feel a pang of jealousy, the hollow ache of being replaced. Rex had once been his, and now the dog was opening up to others, while he remained on the outside, watching from the periphery. One afternoon, as John sat on the porch, he saw the children playing with Rex in the yard, the dog jumping and running with them, his tail wagging in excitement. The sight sent a jolt of pain through John's chest. He knew the bond was still there, somewhere, but it felt like Rex was slipping away, more and more each day. It was on a particularly difficult day that John decided to take a more drastic step. The emotional toll of the disconnection had worn him down to the point where he could no longer bear it. He knew that he had to push Rex to confront the past, to finally bridge the gap between them. With determination, John took Rex on a long walk to the park, a place where they had spent many peaceful afternoons before the war. The sounds of children playing, birds singing, and the rustling of leaves in the breeze were calming, yet the atmosphere was charged with tension. The walk was quiet, with only the sound of their footsteps accompanying them. But as they approached the small pond, something shifted in Rex. For the first time in months, the dog seemed to be more present, more aware. John stopped, turning to face Rex. For a long moment, the two stood there, staring at each other as if searching for something deep within. And then, as if on cue, Rex's tail gave a small, tentative wag. It was a brief gesture, but it was enough. John exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. In that moment, he knew that they weren't completely lost, that the bond could be rebuilt. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but it was possible. The emotional journey for both of them was just beginning. The bond between John and Rex had come so close to shattering that John began to wonder if they would ever truly be able to reconnect. Days blurred into weeks, each one filled with hopeful attempts, fleeting moments, and devastating setbacks. Every time Rex seemed to inch closer, the dog would pull away, and John felt the weight of a war that had never truly ended. His emotional struggle intensified as he tried to convince himself that they could overcome this rift. Rex had once been his lifeline, his guardian, his partner. But now it seemed as though the dog was a stranger. John had lost everything once before. He could not bear to lose Rex as well. There was a day, though, when something changed. It began like any other. The soft light of the morning creeping through the curtains, the familiar hum of the house as John went about his routine. Rex was in his usual spot by the window, watching the world outside with an air of detachment. The gulf between them was still there, but John had come to accept it. He knew the dog was still inside somewhere, but he wasn't sure how to reach him anymore. John stood at the kitchen counter, making a simple breakfast, when a thought struck him, something he hadn't tried before. He had been focusing so much on their past, on the moments they had shared in war, but he had never really tried to bring the present into the equation. Perhaps the dog needed to feel safe in the here and now, not just in the memories of what had been. John grabbed Rex's old toy, a small, worn-out ball they used to play fetch with. He had tried it before, but the dog had never reacted the way he hoped. The toy had been a symbol of their bond, a small shared piece of happiness in a world that was often filled with danger and darkness. This time he tried something different. He didn't just throw the ball. He slowly knelt down, staring at the dog with intent, holding the ball just in front of Rex's face. The dog's eyes flickered, his gaze locking with John's for a moment, then quickly darting away. "Rex," John said softly. The name rolling off his tongue with a tenderness he hadn't allowed himself to express before. "It's me. It's really me, boy. Remember? Remember us?" At first, Rex didn't respond. But then, the faintest twitch in the dog's ear made John pause. The silence stretched, heavy and charged with anticipation. John's breath caught in his throat. He had never realized how much he longed for the sound of Rex's bark, the wag of his tail, the presence of the dog beside him. John slowly extended his hand toward the dog, his fingers trembling. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like the most important one he had ever made. For a long moment, nothing happened. Rex's eyes flickered again, hesitant, uncertain. But then, as if in slow motion, Rex's tail began to move. At first, it was barely a twitch, But then it grew more pronounced. The wag of the tail was tentative at first, but it gained strength as the dog took a few steps closer, the distance between them shrinking. John's heart pounded in his chest as he realized what was happening. Rex was approaching him, not out of fear, but out of a deep emotional recognition that had been buried for so long. The moment that followed felt like an eternity. The room seemed to still, and all that mattered was the connection that was slowly, painfully, being restored between them. John reached out one more. This time, Rex didn't flinch. He stepped forward, gently nuzzling John's hand with his nose. A soft, quiet bark broke the silence. A sound so familiar, yet so foreign. The dog had remembered him. The recognition was not instant, not as easy as it once would have been. But it was real. It was undeniable. John's eyes welled up, tears blurring his vision as he pulled Rex close. The dog's fur was rough and worn from time, but the warmth of his body was enough to confirm that the bond was still there, just waiting to be reignited. John buried his face in the dog's fur, letting out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. The weight of the world seemed to lift for just a moment. And in that instant, John knew that they had found their way back to each other. But the moment was not without its complexities. As John sat there holding Rex, there was a sudden flash of doubt. It wasn't the kind of doubt that shattered the moment, but the kind that lingered in the back of his mind. Was the connection really back? Or was this just a fleeting moment of nostalgia, a trick his heart had played on him? Rex's tail continued to wag, slower now, but the dog was calm, as if accepting John's presence once more. Still, a small part of John couldn't shake the uncertainty. The fear that it might all slip away again was a shadow that loomed, no matter how much he wished to ignore it. Rex shifted slightly, leaning into John's side, and for the first time in months, John felt like himself again. He wasn't just the soldier who had lost his purpose. He was a man reunited with his dog, his partner, his best friend. But even as they sat together in the quiet room, the lingering uncertainty remained. The journey they had been on was not over. There was still much work to be done, still much healing to be had. But in this moment, John knew one thing with absolute certainty: they were no longer broken. They were a team again. As the room grew quiet, the two of them remained together. John's hand rested on Rex's head, and he closed his eyes, savoring the warmth of the connection they had fought so hard to rebuild. The past would never be fully erased. The scars of war, the wounds of separation, would always linger. But the future was theirs to shape. Together. John and Rex sat side by side, the world outside their window bathed in the soft golden light of the setting sun. The air in the house was heavy with the scent of familiar comforts. Coffee brewing, a faint trace of leather from Rex's collar, the subtle hum of life continuing in the wake of their personal battle. But even in the quiet, John could feel the weight of their shared experience, the complexity of what they had gone through still hanging in the balance. They had come so far, yet there was an undeniable truth. They weren't fully healed. Not yet. It had been weeks since the emotional breakthrough, when Rex had finally recognized him, that fragile moment of connection that had felt like a long-awaited reunion. The moments following that day had been a mix of joy and uncertainty, of progress and setbacks. They were no longer strangers, but neither were they the same pair who had once fought side by side in foreign lands, a unit unbreakable in their bond. Healing was not a straight path. It was messy, full of twists and turns, dips and peaks, just like the war they had both survived, albeit in different ways. Rex, once the vigilant protector, now followed John around the house with more assurance, yet his caution remained. There were times when the dog would lie by the window, staring out at the street with that familiar alert stance, ready to defend, ready to act, if necessary. But now there was an unspoken peace between them. The tension that had plagued their first days together was giving way to something gentler, a shared understanding of the new rhythm their lives had to follow. John would often catch himself pausing to watch Rex, his heart swelling with pride. His dog, the one he had trusted with his life on the battlefield, was no longer a reflection of the trauma they had both endured. Instead, Rex was now a companion on the road to healing, a reminder of the strength that could come from vulnerability. from accepting what had happened and learning to move forward. For John, it was a constant reminder that healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning to live with it, accepting its scars, and still finding a way to be whole again. There were mornings when John would sit by the porch, coffee in hand, watching Rex trot around the yard. The dog would chase after squirrels or lounge lazily in the sun, seemingly at peace. It was moments like these that John allowed himself to believe they had made progress. The once sharp, jagged edges of their emotional wounds had softened, becoming more manageable with time. But just when John thought he had a grasp on it all, Rex would pull away again, a reminder that some things could not be rushed, some wounds could not be healed with mere patience, but the discomfort was no longer as harsh as it once was. John had learned to let it be, accepting that, like him, Rex needed time. Time to adjust, time to process, and time to remember who they were to each other. There was still a long road ahead of them, but now they were no longer stumbling in the dark. They had found light, however dim, at the end of the tunnel. And that light was enough to guide them forward, step by step. John's emotional journey had been long and arduous. He had once believed that the pain of war would define him forever, that the shadows of his past would follow him for the rest of his life. But with Rex, John had learned that healing wasn't a destination, it was a journey, one that would stretch out, perhaps for the rest of his life. But it was a journey he wasn't walking alone anymore. It was in the quiet moments, in the small victories, that John realized the full depth of their growth. It was in the days when Rex would look up at him with a gaze that said everything, or when the dog would sit quietly at his side, not out of obligation, but out of choice, that John understood just how far they had come. They were no longer defined by their past. They were defined by their present and by the trust they had built together. Trust that had been broken, but never destroyed. John had learned that loyalty wasn't just about standing beside someone through the good times. It was about being there when things fell apart, when everything seemed uncertain, and when the world felt like it was closing in. It was about finding strength in each other, even when the scars were still visible, even when the pain was still raw. As they spent more time together, the bond between them grew stronger. John began to understand that Rex wasn't just a dog. He was a part of him, a reflection of the resilience that John had always known existed within him, but had only recently begun to truly see. Rex had been through the same struggles, the same trauma. He had witnessed the horrors of war, the same way John had, and had been left to bear its weight. But just as John had learned to rebuild, so had Rex. Both of them had learned to face the pain, to acknowledge the scars, and to move forward with what remained. One evening, as the sun set and cast a golden glow over the room, John and Rex sat together watching the day come to a close. The air was thick with the quiet hum of life, the kind that only comes when you've made peace with the chaos of the world. John could feel it in his bones. There was still more to learn, still more to heal, but they were no longer in this alone. They had come together, found understanding, and had slowly begun to rebuild a life that had been shattered. It was in those moments of calm, in the quiet reflection, that John realized what had been so elusive for so long. Peace wasn't about the absence of pain or the absence of struggle. Peace was about accepting what had been and choosing to move forward with the lessons learned. It was about trusting that even when the world felt like it was unraveling, there was always a way to rebuild. That was the true meaning of loyalty, the true meaning of second chances. The journey was far from over, but John knew now that they had something stronger than just survival. They had the possibility of a future built on the foundation of understanding, healing, and the unwavering bond of trust between a man and his dog. As John stood up, Rex at his side, the two of them walked into the fading light, ready to face whatever came next. Together. There would be more challenges ahead, more moments of doubt, more struggles to overcome. But whatever came, they would face it side by side, knowing that the path they walked, though uncertain, was their own. And that was enough. If you believe that loyalty, healing, and second chances can transform lives, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Our bond with the ones we love, whether human or animal, can change everything. and this journey of a soldier and his dog is proof of that. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder of the strength we all carry, and don't forget to tap the notification bell so you never miss another heartwarming tale. Thank you for watching, and remember, every moment is an opportunity for growth, connection, and second chances.